On a quiet stretch of the Hudson River, where fog drifts low and time seems to hesitate, a stone castle rises from a forgotten island out of place, unfinished, and quietly defiant. This is not a medieval fortress, nor the ruin of a fallen kingdom. It is the legacy of one man, Francis Bannerman VI, who believed power could be made permanent if it were built large enough, high enough, and carved deeply enough into stone. What remains today is not the empire he imagined, but the question he never answered. How long can ambition survive after the dreamer is gone? This is the story of Bannerman Castle, a monument to confidence, a warning written in ruins, and an unfinished dream still echoing across the water. In the broad, deliberate flow of the Hudson River, where the water moves with a quiet authority between wooded hills and ancient rock formations, there lies a small island that for centuries held no importance beyond its physical presence. Polypel Island was once nothing more than a dark silhouette against the river mist, passed by ferries, barges, and military vessels without a second glance. Yet at the dawn of the 20th century, this modest island would become the foundation for one of the most unusual architectural statements in American history, a castle not born from medieval warfare or royal lineage, but from commerce, memory, and a deeply personal vision of power. This was the beginning of Bannerman Castle. The story begins with Francis Bannerman VI, a man shaped as much by heritage as by historical opportunity. Born in Brooklyn in 1851 to Scottish immigrant parents, Bannerman grew up in a household where stories of ancestral stone fortresses and Highland resilience were not distant myths, but living symbols of endurance and legitimacy. In Europe, castles were not merely homes or defenses, they were declarations of permanence. For Bannerman, these ideas settled deeply into his imagination long before he acquired wealth or influence. America, by contrast, was a young nation still defining what power looked like in physical form. Its monuments were banks, factories, railroads, and armories, functional structures reflecting industry rather than lineage. Bannerman would ultimately fuse these two worlds, the old European language of stone and towers, with the new American reality of industrial-scale warfare and private enterprise. By the late 19th century, Bannerman had positioned himself at the center of a lucrative but morally complex industry. Through his company, Bannerman's Military Goods, he purchased surplus weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and explosives left behind by American conflicts, most notably the Civil War and later the Spanish-American War. Entire shiploads of rifles, artillery shells, cannons, and gunpowder passed through his hands. Bannerman was not a general, nor a politician, yet his influence quietly expanded through the logistics of war itself. This was an era when the United States was stepping onto the global stage, projecting military power beyond its borders for the first time. Wars created excess, and excess created opportunity. Bannerman understood this with remarkable clarity. But with that understanding came a practical problem: where to store an ever-growing mountain of volatile material. Manhattan warehouses had already proven dangerously inadequate. Explosions and fires were not theoretical risks, they were documented realities. Polypel Island offered a solution that was both practical and symbolic. Isolated, surrounded by water, and legally permissive, it allowed Bannerman to store vast quantities of explosives far from dense populations. Yet from the moment he acquired the island in 1900, his vision extended far beyond a simple storage depot. Bannerman did not intend to hide his success. He intended to monumentalize it. Construction on Bannerman Castle began slowly, deliberately, and without formal architectural blueprints. Bannerman himself acted as designer, guided by memory rather than academic training. The result was a structure that defied American architectural conventions. Thick stone walls rose directly from the island's bedrock. Towers with crenellations and narrow windows evoked medieval fortresses rather than modern warehouses. Across the facade, Bannerman embedded massive stone letters, spelling his name, an unmistakable assertion of ownership and legacy. This was not a castle built for defense against armies, nor for the comfort of nobility. It was a castle built to house weapons of modern war, wrapped in the visual language of ancient power. Inside, behind walls that suggested romance and antiquity, were stacked artillery shells, crates of ammunition, and barrels of gunpowder. Beauty and danger coexisted in uneasy balance. Standing on the island and gazing across the Hudson, Bannerman could see the arteries of American commerce moving past his creation: steamships, rail-linked barges, and naval traffic connecting New York City to the wider world. The castle was positioned not only geographically, but symbolically between past and future, tradition and industry, memory and ambition. Yet even in its earliest days, the contradictions of Bannerman Castle were impossible to ignore. The structure was never truly finished, because Bannerman's ambitions continued to evolve. Towers were added, walls extended, and storage wings expanded as his inventory grew. The castle became less a completed monument and more a living projection of a man's expanding identity. In this way, Bannerman Castle mirrored the era that produced it: restless, confident, and blind to its own fragility. Bannerman believed that stone could preserve legacy, that mass and scale could defy impermanence. History would prove otherwise. The very elements that made the castle impressive, its isolation, its unregulated construction, its dependence on explosive contents, also planted the seeds of its decline. But at the dawn of the 20th century, none of that was yet visible. The castle stood proud, rising from the river like an echo of Europe, transplanted onto American soil. Part 1 of this story is the chronicle of creation: a man, a river, an island, and a belief that power could be made eternal through architecture. It is the calm before the unraveling, a moment suspended in confidence, before time, nature, and consequence begin to speak. By the first decade of the 20th century, Bannerman Castle had moved beyond the realm of private eccentricity and entered a phase of sheer industrial magnitude. What had begun as an ambitious storage solution was now transforming into one of the largest privately owned weapons depots in the United States. The island of Polypel no longer slept in obscurity. It labored continuously under the weight of global conflict, commerce, and unchecked confidence. At the center of this expanding world stood Francis Bannerman VI, now a man fully aware of the scale of his influence. Bannerman's company was supplying military goods, not only to domestic buyers, but to foreign governments, militias, and security forces across the globe. In an era before modern arms regulations, surplus weapons flowed freely through private hands, and Bannerman had mastered the logistics of this shadowed economy. Cannons captured during the Spanish-American War, rifles decommissioned from U.S. armories, and crates of ammunition, once destined for colonial battlefields, were all ferried upriver, unloaded onto Polypel Island, and sealed behind castle walls. From the water, the structure had grown imposing to the point of disbelief. Towers multiplied, storage wings extended outward like ribs, and stone parapets climbed higher with each passing year. To observers aboard riverboats on the Hudson River, Bannerman Castle appeared less like a warehouse and more like a feudal stronghold that had somehow drifted across centuries and continents to anchor itself in New York State. The illusion was intentional. Bannerman understood spectacle. His castle was not hidden, it was meant to be seen, discussed, and remembered. Inside, however, the reality was far removed from the romance suggested by the exterior. Narrow corridors led to cavernous chambers stacked floor to ceiling with explosives. Wooden crates stamped with military insignia were packed so tightly that movement became difficult. Gunpowder barrels absorbed moisture from the river air, while artillery shells rested in long rows, silent and inert yet never truly stable. Safety standards were minimal by modern definitions, and the castle's construction had never been reviewed by engineers trained to manage such volatile contents. The paradox deepened with every passing year. Bannerman Castle projected permanence, yet it was filled with materials designed for destruction. It symbolized control, yet its internal balance depended on luck as much as planning. This contradiction went largely unchallenged, because Bannerman's success shielded him from scrutiny. Accidents had already occurred in his Manhattan warehouses years earlier. But Polypel Island's isolation created a dangerous sense of immunity. The river, Bannerman believed, would contain any catastrophe. This period marked the height of Bannerman's confidence. He expanded not only his storage facilities but his vision of legacy. Bannerman Castle was never intended as a residence, yet it was deeply personal. He brought family members and guests to the island, guiding them through selected areas while keeping the most hazardous zones sealed. To visitors, the castle appeared as a monument to ingenuity and boldness, proof that an immigrant's son could carve his name into the American landscape as decisively as any industrial tycoon. But history was shifting beneath his feet. The early 20th century ushered in rapid changes in warfare and regulation. As global tensions increased, governments began to recognize the risks posed by privately controlled arsenals of this magnitude. Insurance companies grew wary. Transportation laws tightened. The romantic age of surplus arms trading was nearing its end, even as Bannerman continued to expand as if it were eternal. Then, in 1918, the illusion fractured. On a quiet summer morning, a massive explosion tore through one of the castle's storage areas. The blast was so powerful, it shattered windows miles away and sent debris raining into the Hudson. Smoke rose from Polypel Island in a column visible across the river, transforming the castle from a symbol of dominance into a site of sudden vulnerability. Although no lives were lost in the explosion, the damage was catastrophic. Entire sections of the structure were destroyed, walls collapsed, and inventories worth millions were obliterated in seconds. The explosion marked a turning point, not only for Bannerman Castle, but for Bannerman himself. Investigations followed. Authorities questioned the wisdom of storing such quantities of explosives so close to vital transportation corridors. Public perception shifted from admiration to unease. What had once seemed bold now appeared reckless. For Bannerman, the explosion was both a financial and psychological blow. The castle, once a controlled environment reflecting his mastery, had revealed its true nature as a fragile system balanced on risk. Yet even after the disaster, Bannerman refused to abandon the island entirely. Repairs were made, inventories reduced, and operations scaled back, but the dream was already compromised. When Bannerman died in 1918, only months after the explosion, the castle entered a new phase of existence, one defined by absence. Without its creator, Bannerman Castle lost the singular will that had driven its growth. His heirs inherited not only the structure, but its liabilities, legal, financial, and structural. What had been sustained by personal vision now faced the cold scrutiny of modern regulation and economic reality. Part 2 of this story captures the peak and the fracture. A moment when ambition reached its highest point, only to expose the instability beneath. Bannerman Castle did not fall in war, nor was it conquered. It began to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, long before nature and time would finish the work. The death of Francis Bannerman VI marked a decisive rupture in the life of Bannerman Castle. What followed was not an immediate collapse, but something far more subtle and far more relentless: absence. Without the singular force of its creator, his will, his resources, and his belief in the castle's purpose, the structure entered a long, quiet descent into irrelevance. Power, once concentrated in a single vision, dispersed, and the island began to drift into a historical limbo. In the years after 1918, Bannerman's heirs attempted to maintain fragments of the business. Some inventory remained on Polypel Island, but the era that had allowed such a private arsenal to exist was rapidly closing. New regulations governing explosives, tighter oversight of transportation routes, and shifting military procurement practices made large-scale private storage increasingly untenable. What had once been a strategic advantage, the island's isolation in the Hudson River, now became a logistical burden. Gradually, activity on the island slowed. Barges arrived less frequently, Doors that once opened daily were sealed and left untouched. Inside the castle, dust settled onto crates and stone alike, softening edges and dulling the sharp smell of oil and metal. The walls still stood, but they no longer served a living function. Bannerman Castle had become something new, a monument without a role. Nature, indifferent to ambition, moved patiently. Moisture seeped into mortar joints. Winter freezes widened hairline cracks in the stone. Ivy and moss found purchase along parapets and stairways, reclaiming surfaces once carved to project permanence. Unlike castles in Europe, maintained for centuries by states or dynasties, Bannerman Castle had no institutional guardian. It existed in a space between private ownership and public memory, protected by neither. In 1920, a fire tore through parts of the structure, consuming wooden floors and roof sections. The flames did not destroy the castle outright, but they stripped away layers of functionality and safety. From that moment forward, Bannerman Castle was undeniably a ruin in the making. The fire revealed how little margin for resilience the structure possessed once active maintenance ceased. Stone alone could not preserve it. As decades passed, the castle became a visual paradox for those traveling the river. To tourists aboard Hudson River excursion boats, its silhouette remained dramatic, towers rising from mist, walls catching the low light of dawn and dusk. It looked eternal from a distance. Up close, however, decay was unmistakable. Floors collapsed inward. Staircases led to nothing. Open windows framed empty air. During the mid-20th century, Bannerman Castle slipped further from public consciousness, overshadowed by global wars, suburban expansion, and new architectural icons. Yet it never fully disappeared. The ruin persisted as a curiosity, a question mark embedded in the landscape. Locals told stories, some accurate, some exaggerated, about explosions, secret tunnels, and hidden weapons. The castle became mythologized precisely because it was inaccessible and unresolved. Ownership of the island passed through hands, but responsibility remained elusive. Restoring the castle was prohibitively expensive. Demolishing it was politically and symbolically fraught. And so it remained, suspended between choices, slowly surrendering to gravity and weather. This long period of neglect transformed the meaning of Bannerman Castle. It no longer represented commercial power or industrial confidence. Instead, it became a cautionary structure, a physical reminder that ambition without continuity cannot sustain itself. The castle had been built to defy time. Yet time proved to be its most patient adversary. By the late 20th century, awareness of the castle's historical value began to resurface. Preservationists and historians recognized that Bannerman Castle was not merely an eccentric ruin, but a rare artifact of a specific American moment, when private enterprise, military surplus, and personal legacy intersected without restraint. Its decay told a story as important as its construction. Part 3 is the chapter of quiet erosion. There are no grand battles here, no dramatic declarations. Only stone yielding to seasons, memory fading and then returning, and a landscape slowly absorbing a human attempt at permanence. Bannerman Castle had not fallen. It had been left behind, and in that abandonment, its true historical voice began to emerge. By the final decades of the 20th century, Bannerman Castle had crossed an invisible threshold. What was once viewed as a decaying liability, dangerous, unstable, and inconvenient, began to be seen through a different lens. Across the United States, attitudes toward industrial ruins and unconventional heritage sites were shifting. Structures that had long been dismissed as failures were being reconsidered as documents in stone, capable of telling stories that polished monuments never could. Bannerman Castle, isolated yet unforgettable, stood ready to be reinterpreted. From the decks of boats moving steadily along the Hudson River, the castle's silhouette had never lost its power. Generations who had grown up seeing its towers from afar began to ask new questions: who built it? Why was it abandoned? And what would it mean to let it disappear entirely? These questions marked the beginning of the castle's second life, not as a fortress of commerce, but as a fragile artifact of memory. In the 1990s, preservation advocates, historians, and local citizens formed what would become the Bannerman Castle Trust. Their goal was not to restore the castle to a finished state. Such an undertaking would have required resources far beyond feasibility, but to stabilize it, document it, and protect it from total collapse. This distinction was crucial. Bannerman Castle could not, and perhaps should not, be returned to what it once was. Its ruin was part of its truth. The task ahead was daunting. Decades of neglect had left walls cracked, roofs gone, and interiors unsafe. Every step on the island required caution. Engineers and conservationists had to balance intervention with restraint, ensuring that efforts to preserve did not erase the very signs of time that gave the structure meaning. Stone by stone, sections were reinforced. Vegetation was carefully managed rather than aggressively removed. The goal was survival, not perfection. Public access became a central and controversial issue. Opening the island to visitors carried risk, but isolation had proven even more dangerous. Carefully guided tours were introduced, allowing people to walk among the ruins, hear the story of Francis Bannerman VI, and witness firsthand the consequences of ambition left unsupported by continuity. These tours transformed Bannerman Castle from a distant curiosity into an experiential narrative. Visitors no longer saw just a ruin, they encountered a life, a business, and an era frozen in stone. Yet preservation efforts were repeatedly tested. In 2009, a major section of the castle collapsed without warning, sending tons of stone crashing inward. The event underscored the fragility of the structure and the limits of human control. It was a reminder that preservation is not a victory over time, but a negotiation with it. Each success was temporary. Each failure carried lessons. Despite these setbacks, interest in Bannerman Castle continued to grow. Scholars recognized its uniqueness. There is no true architectural parallel in the United States. It is neither a military fort nor a residence, neither purely industrial nor purely symbolic. It exists at the intersection of private enterprise, immigrant identity, and the American relationship with power. Its very impracticality is what makes it historically valuable. In this phase of its existence, Bannerman Castle began to speak more clearly than it ever had in its prime. As a ruin, it revealed truths that had been hidden by confidence and scale. It showed how individual ambition can shape landscapes, and how those landscapes respond once that ambition fades. It demonstrated that legacy cannot be imposed. It must be sustained, interpreted, and shared. Part 4 is the story of resistance, not resistance against invaders or armies, but against forgetting. It is about people who chose to see value where decay dominated, and meaning where failure seemed obvious. Bannerman Castle survived not because it was strong, but because it was remembered. As the 21st century unfolded, Bannerman Castle entered a phase that its creator could never have anticipated. No longer a functioning asset, no longer a neglected hazard, it became something more elusive and more enduring. A symbol. Seen from the water or encountered through guided passageways, the castle now speaks not in the language of commerce or accumulation, but in that of consequence. Its broken walls invite reflection on what power means when its material foundations erode. The modern visitor approaches the island with a different set of expectations than those who once stood before its gates in the early 1900s. Today, Bannerman Castle is not judged by what it can store or protect, but by what it can reveal. It reveals a moment in American history, when private ambition moved faster than public regulation, when success was measured by scale and visibility, and when the belief in permanence was strong enough to be built into stone. The ruin exposes the cost of that belief. At the center of this legacy remains Francis Bannerman VI, not as a villain nor as a hero, but as a representative figure of his time. Bannerman embodied a uniquely American synthesis. Immigrant memory fused with industrial opportunity, personal identity expressed through monumental construction. His castle was never merely a warehouse. It was an assertion that success deserved a physical monument. Yet history rarely preserves monuments in the way their builders intend. It reshapes them, repurposes them, and sometimes reduces them to fragments that speak more honestly than intact facades ever could. The landscape surrounding the castle plays an essential role in this transformation. The steady movement of the Hudson River continues as it always has, indifferent to human ambition. Barges still pass. Trains still follow the river's edge. The castle, once aligned with the rhythms of trade and transport, now stands apart from them, a silent observer rather than an active participant. This contrast sharpens its meaning. Where Bannerman sought to anchor himself permanently within the flow of history, the river reminds us that history moves on regardless. Preservation efforts have deliberately resisted the temptation to romanticize the structure beyond recognition. Cracks remain visible. Missing sections are not disguised. The ruin is allowed to tell the truth of its condition. In this honesty lies its greatest educational value. Bannerman Castle demonstrates that power achieved quickly, without systems to sustain it, decays just as quickly once its driving force disappears. Stone alone cannot substitute for continuity. In academic circles, the castle has become a case study in unconventional heritage. It challenges traditional definitions of what deserves preservation. It is not associated with a great battle or a founding moment of the nation. Its importance lies instead in its ambiguity. It forces historians and visitors alike to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we measure success? What kinds of ambition do we choose to remember? And how do we treat the physical remains of enterprises that no longer align with contemporary values? For the public, Bannerman Castle occupies a rare emotional space. It inspires awe without triumph, curiosity without resolution. Children look at its towers and imagine fairy tales, while adults recognize the caution embedded in its decay. This duality ensures its relevance. It speaks across generations precisely because it does not offer a simple moral. It does not condemn ambition outright, nor does it celebrate it uncritically. It shows what happens when ambition is allowed to harden into stone, without planning for the future that follows success. Part 5 reframes Bannerman Castle not as a failed dream, but as an incomplete conversation between past and present. Its unfinished state is not a flaw, it is its meaning. The castle endures because it was never resolved. In its ruins, power is stripped of certainty, and memory becomes active rather than fixed. What remains is not the empire Bannerman imagined, but something arguably more lasting, a place that asks us to think. When Bannerman Castle is placed within the long arc of American history, its meaning sharpens and deepens. It ceases to be merely an eccentric ruin on a river island, and becomes instead a lens through which the nation's evolving relationship with power, ambition, and permanence can be examined. The castle stands at the intersection of private enterprise and public consequence, revealing how personal vision can shape landscapes long after its original purpose has faded. The United States has rarely expressed power through castles. Its confidence has more often taken the form of skyscrapers, factories, bridges, and armory structures designed for speed, efficiency, and expansion. Bannerman Castle defied this tradition. It borrowed the visual language of European authority and transplanted it into an American setting that neither required nor fully understood it. In doing so, it exposed a tension that runs through the country's history, the desire for inherited legitimacy in a nation built on reinvention. At the heart of this tension remains Francis Bannerman VI, whose life embodies both the promise and the limits of the American dream. Bannerman rose through opportunity, intelligence, and timing. He capitalized on the byproducts of war and transformed surplus into wealth. Yet his ultimate ambition was not simply profit. It was remembrance. The castle was meant to say, "I was here, and I mattered." History, however, rarely grants immortality on an individual's terms. As decades passed, Bannerman Castle transitioned from private possession to shared inheritance, not owned by the public in a traditional sense, but held in trust by memory, scholarship, and stewardship. This shift mirrors a broader American reckoning with the remnants of industrial and military power. Across the country, sites once dedicated to production, extraction, or defense have outlived their functions. Some have been erased. Others, like Bannerman Castle, have been allowed to remain imperfect, incomplete, and honest. The setting amplifies this truth. The Hudson River continues its unbroken movement, a constant against which human effort appears momentary. The river carried Bannerman's goods, bore witness to explosions and abandonment, and now reflects the castle's broken silhouette at sunset. In this continuity, the river becomes the true monument, while the castle becomes commentary, a reminder that human structures endure only as long as their meanings are renewed. In its ruined state, Bannerman Castle achieves a clarity it never possessed at its peak. When it was whole, it spoke primarily of ownership and control. Now, fragmented and exposed, it speaks of limits. It demonstrates that power without succession is fragile, that ambition without adaptability becomes obsolete, and that stone cannot freeze time. These lessons are not unique to Bannerman Castle, but they are unusually visible here, written plainly into walls that no longer pretend to be invincible. For historians, the castle remains invaluable precisely because it resists easy categorization. It is not heroic, yet not disgraceful. It is not a triumph, yet not a failure. It is unresolved, and in that unresolved state, it mirrors the nation that produced it, restless, experimental, and perpetually unfinished. Bannerman Castle belongs to a lineage of American places that reveal more in decline than they ever did in success. As this story closes, Bannerman Castle does not offer a conclusion in the traditional sense. There is no restoration that will return it to its original form, and no demolition that will erase it without loss. Instead, it exists in a narrow space between preservation and disappearance, sustained by those who believe that history's questions matter more than its answers. The unfinished dream of Bannerman Castle endures not as a warning carved in stone, but as an invitation. An invitation to look closely at what we build, why we build it, and what we expect it to mean once we are gone. In the quiet between river currents and crumbling walls, Bannerman Castle continues to ask that question patiently, endlessly, and without demanding a reply. There are places where history does not end, but softens, where it stops speaking in dates and names, and begins to speak in atmosphere, silence, and absence. Bannerman Castle has become such a place. Long after commerce ceased, after explosions echoed and repairs failed, after ambition dissolved into stewardship, the castle remains not as a conclusion, but as a question suspended in air. To stand before Bannerman Castle today is to experience a form of historical tension. The structure does not demand admiration, nor does it ask for pity. Instead, it invites contemplation. Its broken towers frame the sky rather than dominate it. Its walls no longer protect anything tangible. And yet, they still hold meaning. This is the paradox of ruins. When utility fades, symbolism intensifies. The story of Francis Bannerman VI ultimately transcends the man himself. Bannerman believed that permanence could be engineered, that legacy could be constructed through mass, scale, and visibility. He was not alone in this belief. Entire eras have shared it. Bannerman Castle simply made that belief unusually literal, turning private ambition into a public silhouette etched against the landscape. In this final form, the castle speaks less about Bannerman and more about the culture that enabled him. Early 20th century America rewarded speed, expansion, and confidence. It encouraged individuals to build first and ask questions later. Bannerman Castle emerged from that ethos, and its decline traces the moment when that worldview encountered its limits. Regulation replaced improvisation. Institutions replaced individuals. Continuity replaced spectacle. The Hudson River continues to provide the castle's most eloquent counterpoint. The river does not change course to accommodate human dreams. It carries them briefly, reflects them faintly, and then moves on. In this relationship, Bannerman Castle appears less like a failure and more like a footnote, an interruption, in a much longer story, written by water, stone, and time. Visitors often describe a sense of quiet humility upon leaving the island. The castle does not overwhelm, it humbles. It reveals how quickly certainty erodes, how fragile control can be, and how memory depends not on grandeur, but on care. The fact that Bannerman Castle still stands, however fractured, is not a testament to its strength, but to attention. Someone chose to notice. Someone chose not to forget. In this way, the unfinished dream finds an unexpected resolution. Bannerman sought permanence through ownership. The castle achieves endurance through shared responsibility. It no longer belongs to one man's ambition, but to a collective understanding that history is not only what succeeds, but what remains visible after success passes. Part 7 closes not with an ending, but with a stillness. Bannerman Castle endures in that stillness between ruin and preservation, between warning and wonder. Its stones no longer proclaim power. They ask for reflection. And perhaps that, more than anything its builder imagined, is what allows it to last. History rarely ends where we expect it to. More often, it dissolves into something quieter, less defined, and far more enduring. Bannerman Castle now exists in this quiet space beyond conclusion, a phase of history shaped not by builders or explosions, but by reflection. Long after its original purpose vanished, the castle remains suspended between presence and disappearance, asking what survives when ambition has exhausted itself. In this final phase, Bannerman Castle is no longer primarily a story about construction, commerce, or even decay. It is a story about inheritance. Not inheritance of property or wealth, but inheritance of responsibility. The castle has passed from the hands of its creator into the custody of time, memory, and interpretation. Each generation encounters it differently, not because the structure changes dramatically, but because the questions we bring to it change. For Francis Bannerman VI, permanence was imagined as solidity. Stone walls. Towers visible for miles. A name carved so deeply it could not be ignored. Yet the irony of Bannerman Castle is that its endurance has little to do with the strength of its construction and everything to do with the weakness it eventually revealed. The castle survives not as a completed statement, but as an exposed one. Its cracks speak louder than its inscriptions ever did. Today, the castle's meaning is no longer dictated by intention, but by experience. Visitors do not arrive seeking proof of power. They arrive seeking understanding. They walk carefully across uneven ground, guided not by ownership but by trust. They see where floors once stood, where ceilings collapsed, where rooms designed to contain weapons now hold only air and light. In these absences, history becomes tangible. The past is no longer sealed behind glass, it is entered physically, cautiously, and with awareness. Preservationists often describe Bannerman Castle as a lesson in limits. There are limits to what can be saved, limits to what should be restored, and limits to how much control the present should exert over the past. Unlike reconstructed monuments that present a polished version of history, Bannerman Castle resists completion. Its unfinished state is not a failure of preservation, but a deliberate ethical choice. To rebuild it fully would be to erase the very story that gives it meaning. This philosophy places Bannerman Castle within a broader shift in historical thinking. Modern preservation no longer seeks to freeze sites at their moment of greatest power. Instead, it asks how decline itself can educate. Bannerman Castle teaches that ambition, when isolated from long-term stewardship, collapses inward. It teaches that visibility is not the same as durability. And it teaches that history does not reward certainty, it rewards adaptability. The setting deepens these lessons. The Hudson River continues to flow with indifference to human intention. It carried Bannerman's barges, absorbed the shockwaves of explosions, and now reflects moonlight against fractured stone. The river has witnessed indigenous settlements, colonial trade, industrial expansion, and post-industrial retreat. Bannerman Castle is only one chapter in that continuum, and its survival depends on acknowledging that it is not the main story. In winter, ice gathers along the island's edges, while the castle's walls absorb cold they can no longer resist. In summer, vegetation presses closer, testing the boundaries between preservation and reclamation. These cycles remind us that time is not an enemy to be defeated, but a force to be negotiated with humility. Preservation here is not about victory. It is about delay, about giving meaning more time to be seen, questioned, and passed on. As the digital age accelerates the way memory is stored and consumed, Bannerman Castle offers us something increasingly rare: slowness. It cannot be understood instantly. It requires physical effort to reach, mental patience to interpret, and emotional openness to accept ambiguity. In this way, the castle stands in quiet opposition to modern permanence, the illusion that data, images, and names can last forever without care. The final transformation of Bannerman Castle is perhaps the most unexpected. It has become a site where power is no longer displayed, but interrogated. Where legacy is no longer claimed, but negotiated. Where history does not instruct, but invites. The castle does not tell visitors what to think about ambition, capitalism, or memory. It simply stands, incomplete and honest, allowing those questions to surface naturally. If there is a resolution to the unfinished dream of Bannerman Castle, it lies here. Bannerman sought immortality through ownership. The castle achieves endurance through shared attention. Its future is uncertain by design. It will not last forever, and it does not need to. Its value lies not in eternal survival, but in the time it continues to open space for reflection. In the end, Bannerman Castle remains because it is vulnerable. Because it asks for care rather than obedience. Because it accepts impermanence rather than denying it. And in that acceptance, it reaches a form of quiet power that its creator could never have planned. A power rooted not in stone, but in understanding.